Hi guys, so welcome to this crisis case study on Black Summer. So the Australian summer of 2019 to 2020 saw the devastating effects of uncontrollable fires across the country. The fires, which started from September 2019 to March 20, burnt approximately 18.6 million hectares, destroying nearly 6,000 buildings and killed 34 people and billions of native animals, some already threatened by extinction. Air quality in southern and eastern states reached hazardous levels, with Canberra recording the worst air quality globally. Australia's economy was affected due to rescue and recovery efforts, loss of tourism and social costs, including impact on well-being and loss of wages. Leading scientists attributed human-caused climate change as the primary cause for the fires, with the national mean temperature above 1.52 degrees Celsius. Further factors included extreme dryness, below average rainfall and inability to undertake hazard reduction burns in the periods preceding the event. Management of the crisis by the Prime Minister, PM Scott Morrison, and his government was nationally and internationally scrutinised across media sources, social media platforms and amongst lead climate science scholars. Discussions surrounding government preparedness, response and communication of what was coined Black Summer primarily related to the unwillingness to admit the direct connection between climate change and the unprecedented nature of the fires, the government's stance on climate policy and the coal industry, and finally the condemnation of PM Morrison's holiday to Hawaii amid the national crisis. The key points in analysis of the impacts of Black Summer highlight the importance of identifying evolving issues and the potential to progress into crises if not managed properly. This slide shows the daily discussion of climate change and the overall reporting of the bushfires. You can see that there's a strong relationship between the two and demonstrate that despite the government denying its relationship, the media didn't fail to report on the link between the two. The following slide shows a word cloud on the most common words used in reporting Black Summer. So, Jackie suggests that issue management, or IM, provides a coordinated and structured framework for identifying issues early on as to avoid future crises. Multiple theoretical models exist surrounding IM and provide the foundation for decision making which attempts to mitigate threat whilst also promoting opportunities. In the case of Black Summer, the issue life cycle theory and the legitimacy gap theory are applicable in explaining the role of IM. So, the issue life cycle theory highlights that when an issue is left unaddressed and worse yet denied by the institution, the seriousness, risk, available choices and costs increase. The 4 stages noted by Register and Larkin emphasise the importance of stakeholder involvement and the power of awareness mobilisation if needs are not mediated. So stage 1, the origin or the potential issue. So in the case of the Black Summer, CSIRO, national science bodies, fire chiefs and Indigenous leaders had highlighted the threat of the fires if climate change and hazardous conditions were not acknowledged. This then moved on to stage 2, the mediation and amplification, or the emerging issues. This again noted interested groups called for action, media coverage criticised the response, and there was a pressure for action. Stage 3, the organisation, the current and crisis issue. In this case, the public was very aware of the issue through the lived experience and also the extreme media coverage. We also saw large protests taking place condemning the government. Finally, stage 4, where we hope for resolution and the issue has resolved. We see this, but unfortunately in this case, the government did not use this crisis to change legislation related to carbon emissions, climate change, or incorporating Indigenous knowledge into hazard reduction burning. but rather stated that the nation had to adapt to the warmer and drier conditions. So the second model is the legitimacy gap theory, and this also relates to stakeholders' interests and the gap between their expectations and organisations' actions. If this gap is not managed strategically, the issue can threaten the organisation's status in society and have both direct and indirect repercussions. In the case of the fires, the majority of stakeholders, which can be viewed as the wider Australian society and media, voiced their anger and lack of trust in the PM and the government's leadership during this national catastrophe. The handling of the situation and lack of urgency in the government's response led to distrust and reflection, coupled with debate about the causes which gave rise to the event. So both theoretical models highlight the importance of stakeholder involvement and their ability to negatively impact the organisation. So in conclusion, IM is a continuous process which involves constant evaluation and communication in order to learn from previous mistakes and make changes to feedback from both internal and external environments. The next slide shows some further examples of Twitter posts, both nationally and internationally, expressing the dissatisfaction and sadness of the government response. It highlights the gap, the legitimacy gap, and how the events evolved. So the PM and his government unfortunately didn't demonstrate or respond to the real and or perceived concerns of the public during the fires, nor did they change the legislation or regulations surrounding climate and environment commitments. The IAG state that very little has been done since the extreme bushfires, and that it's likely that the frequency and intensity of these crises will increase in the future. Numerous recommendations have been made, ranging from better insurance schemes to policies to reduce initial fire risk. However, for the purpose of this presentation, we'll focus on leadership and crisis communication. So, if we look at Coombs is a leading crisis communication scholar who in 1995 coined the attribution theory, which looked at matching reputation strategies to crisis situations. This theory has now evolved into the situation crisis communication theory and maintains that in order for crisis managers to communicate effectively, they must go through a two-step process. So firstly, identifying the type of crisis, which in this case, it falls into a victim crisis and is normally coupled with low minimal crisis responsibility. However, the second step can change this level of responsibility as it reviews provoking factors before the crisis occurred and may intensify the overall responsibility and strategies needed to recover. For example, the denial of climate change prior to the fires and the damaging energy policies which may have attributed to the severity of the fires. What do we have? We have a minimal attribution crisis coupled with intensifying factors. And it's suggested that the communication strategy suggested is that providing information, expression of sympathy with additional justification to acknowledge that history are necessary elements of crisis communication practices. In conclusion, so leaders are often at the forefront of crises and are spokespersons before, during and after a crisis unfolds. Thus, the way in which crisis communication is framed can facilitate or hamper a response to a crisis. The process of communication requires a dialogue. This facilitates awareness while also understanding potential issues, legitimacy gaps, and stakeholder perceptions. By doing this, crisis communicators can defend their legitimacy whilst also maintaining transparency. The literature suggests that successful leadership and use of framing during crises must engender trust and empathy through transparent, inclusive, and accurate information. That information is then contextualized and can be used as a tool to get the public to see a message in a particular way. Furthermore, as much communication delivered by leaders and governments is filtered through media filters, initial framing holds great importance in overall stakeholders' perception of what is considered an issue and their expectations throughout the event. The Australian Government and the PM really should look at these implications regarding IM and crisis communication, as it is likely that these types of environmental crises and others like the COVID-19 pandemic will continue to occur, stressing the importance of creating alliances with stakeholders to maintain a positive reputation pre, during and post crisis event. Thank you.